Welcome to those who are already online. We are waiting a few seconds to allow more people to join. Welcome to those who are already online. We are just waiting a few minutes to allow everyone to join. Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first webinar of the series Foresight Dialogues, organized by the CMCC, the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. I am Alessandra Mazzai. I'm part of the communication office at the CMCC. I am glad to introduce you today to our guest speaker, Dr. Rebecca Huntley, who is one of Australia's foremost researchers on social trends, who will give us suggestions on how to talk about climate change in a way that makes a difference. Welcome, Rebecca.
Ciao.
CMCC is an Italian research center on climate change and its interaction with the society, the world of business, the policymakers, and the environment. Our work aims to stimulate sustainable growth, protect the environment, and develop strategies for climate change mitigation and adaptation. We want to have an impact, so besides developing scientific research, CMCC is committed to inform and facilitate the dialogue between scientists, decision makers, and the general public to support decisions and actions for the benefit of society. With this aim, we carry on educational programs, events, and communication activities for the public at large, and many outreach initiatives to give voice to the climate change research. Through the Foresight Dialogues, we are hosting writers, artists, journalists, scientists, innovators to discuss the role of communication in accelerating the climate transition. The Foresight Dialogues borrow their name from our digital magazine Foresight, a magazine that looks into the future through interviews to experts, articles, multimedia, and a podcast, Deep into the Future Planet, a podcast inspired by the insights of scientists, artists, and activists, bringing together different voices to look into our future. And this series of webinars, the Foresight Dialogues, is organized in the context of the CMCC Climate Change Communication Award, Rebecca Ballestra. Through this initiative, the CMCC is building an innovative and global growing platform that collects and rewards the best communication initiatives on climate change. We aim to connect their authors in a network that fosters collaboration, offers opportunities, and opens a space for discussion on climate change communication for experts. If you are author of a climate change communication project, the second call for proposal for this award is now open, and you can apply by June 15. Just go to www.cmccaward.eu and you will find all the information. A few technical information. After Rebecca Huntley's presentation, you will have the chance to pose her some questions. You can write your questions directly in the Q&A section of your Zoom screen as they come, even during the presentation, and we will pose them to Rebecca at the end of her talk. I remind you that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel. It's finally time to properly introduce you today's speaker, Rebecca Huntley. She is the Director of Research at the agency 89 Degrees East. She is author of numerous books, including the one who gave the title to today's speech, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference. She is also co-chair of the advisory board for Australian Parents for Climate Action and a member of the advisory group for the Climate Solution Centre at the Australian Museum and the Sydney Environment Institute. Previously, she has led research at Essential Media and Vox Populi and was a director at Ipsos Australia. She ran for a number of years her own research consultancy firm, working closely to climate and environment NGOs, government and business on climate change strategies and communication. Rebecca Huntley will shed light today on current available knowledge on climate change communication, and she will show examples from the case study of Australia, including the analysis of how the broad climate movement helped to create the conditions for the 2022 climate elections by focusing on messages capable of leveraging a more urgent climate action. We have more than 200 people present today. Thank you for your interest and involvement. I give the floor to Rebecca and thank you for your participation.
Thanks so much, Alessandra. It's buonasera here in Sydney, Australia. It's in the evening and it's wonderful to be with you. I'm just going to try and share my screen. And I am going to realize, momento, where are we? From the beginning. Can people see that?
Yes, we can see properly. Yes.
So it's wonderful to be able to present to you. I have to say that, but I really would only give up my evenings to present the work that I'm doing to Italians. So my family's from Italy, and this is as close as I'm going to get to Italy for a while. So it's I know that there would be other people from Europe on the call though, but it's wonderful to be with you. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is a mixture of some of the content from my book, but also some of the actual practical work that I did with the climate movement between the elections, the federal elections of 2019 and 2022. They were elections where there was a real stark difference between how the community responded to messages around climate change, and I was lucky enough to be integrally involved in those campaigns. The first thing I want to show you is this image of all of these very passionate Australians who are part of a campaign against the Adani coal mine. In 2019, when Australia had its second last federal election, it was considered to be, everybody was saying in the media and elsewhere that this was going to be Australia's climate election. Why was that the case? Well, the polling, the established public polling, was showing that climate change was a real concern for Australians. It was kind of 80% of Australians were saying climate change was an issue. We had a federal government that seemed incapable of acting on climate change and in fact couldn't even manage to kind of confirm its energy policy. And there was a lot of infighting in the government at the time, including leaders, knifed and got rid of, and a whole lot of leadership turmoil, which has been a lot in Australia. I know that Italians are also used to leadership turmoil in politics. And all of that leadership turmoil was over climate. In fact, we had some really active climate deniers in the Conservative Party in Australia. And so the broad climate movement and civil society decided that in the lead up to the 2019 election, there would be an absolute focus on one campaign and one message, and that was stopping the Adani mine. It's probably not very familiar to people who aren't familiar with Australian politics, but in the north of Australia, in Queensland, Queensland is a big fossil fuel state, fossil fuels and mining fossil fuels have been very important to the economy of Queensland as well as to Western Australia. The Indian company Adani wanted to open up a very large coal mine in the Galilee Basin. And this was a kind of new coal mine that was not only going to be, hugely problematic for climate change, really destructive to the natural environment, for Indigenous Australians, so First Nations peoples. There was a real concern about what it would do to their rights and their claims. And not only that, the Adani Group were looking at a $900 million loan from the Australian federal government to start this mine. So it was really problematic, and in any way that you can think about it, the climate movement decided to focus their entire movement in the lead up to the 2019 on this Stop Adani campaign. Part of that was, so there were lots and lots of protests, including protesting the funding of that mine, and a lot of protests being directed at banks that might be able to fund that mine. Interestingly, of course, no major Australian bank actually really wanted to fund that mine, and that's why they were looking for funders and capital offshore, as well as support from the federal government. Probably most controversially, led by the Greens Party, there was a convoy from the south of Australia that wound all the way up until the north of Australia, like a protest. So it was people coming from one part of Australia going to another part of Australia protesting. So it was called the convoy. Anyway, so there was this kind of, I would say, sense that 2019 could see the end of a Conservative government that wasn't taking climate change seriously, and that the Adani convoy would, in fact, and the Adani campaign would actually not only boost the vote for the Greens, but help leverage the Labor Party that had slightly better climate policies into government. Of course, that's not what happened. This man was elected Prime Minister, a man who actually brought a lump of coal into the Parliament when he was the Treasurer, waved it at the alternative Prime Minister and say, "This is coal, don't be afraid of it." Just as a funny little aside, this is some time ago, the opposition Labor Party, the kind of Labor Party opposition Minister for Climate Change tried to smuggle a solar panel into the Parliament and hold it up as a kind of, an alternative prop. And he did manage to do that, although you're not actually supposed to be able to do that in Parliament. You've got to be very, be much more dignified and not bring too many kind of objects to wave at the opposition. So 2019 was an extraordinary shock. It was a shock to people like me who do political polling. It was a shock to the Australian Labor Party. It was a shock to journalists. It was a shock pretty much to everybody, but particularly to the climate movement, that somebody who was such a avowed climate denialist, such a huge supporter of fossil fuels, would actually be elected Prime Minister. Now, there's lots of reasons why the election ended up being the way it was, largely because the Labor leader wasn't very positive. But the fact that that happened, and of course, every electoral cycle where we don't vote in governments that are positive about acting on climate, is wasted time that we don't have. It really brought about a significant reflection and rethinking from the climate movement about who it was speaking to and about how it needed to communicate about the urgency of climate change. That you could have 80% of Australians saying climate is a big issue. You could have a very well-financed, very disciplined, very focused campaign that the whole movement got behind, and you could still have a climate denialist, essentially elected to Prime Minister. People thought that it was a disconnect they had to understand. Now, in some of the work that I did after the 2019 election, it was clear that what actually happened is the Adani campaign did have an electoral impact that was positive. it saw a 2 to 3% increase in its primary vote across the country. So what it did is it did galvanise people who were already very, very concerned about climate, who were seeing that the Greens Party were an option. But in some of the electoral analysis that I was involved in post the 2019 election, and I speak about it, I did an oration at the University of Melbourne where I speak in detail about this analysis that we did for WWF, the World Wildlife Fund. We did an analysis that looked at the 2016 election and the 2019 election by each electorate. It classified the swing between the comparison between those two elections, 2016, 2019, in each electorate, classified the various parties according to whether they were pro or anti-environment, and it analysed using Australian Bureau of Statistics data about what kinds of electorates, what kind of types of electorates swung away from pro-environment parties toward anti-environment parties. And what we found is that electorates where people were poorer, where there were more than 2 children in the home, electorates that were in outer suburban areas, so not in the centre of urban centres or necessarily even in regional centres, but outer suburban centres. And ironically, electorates which were at the forefront of climate effects in Australia, such as drought and extreme heat, were the kinds of electorates that swung away from pro-environment parties. This is not new. It's not new in the kind of electoral analysis of where votes for climate go or don't. We know that the more educated, the more urban, the wealthier, households are, individuals are, the more likely they are to be concerned about climate change and express that concern through their vote. But the fact that we had this outcome in 2019, despite all of this focus on, like I said, a very disciplined campaign about a particular mine, really got the climate movement reflecting on, was it really understanding how it was communicating to different audiences, and how were we going to translate this high level of concern about environment into changing governments. It's at that stage, and then not very long after the 2019 election, in fact, in the summer of 2019 into 2020, you might have seen and read, Australia had some of the worst bushfires our country has ever seen in kind of recorded history, post-colonisation. It's almost unfathomable the kind of damage the bushfires did. As you would know, Australia is a large country. The bushfires throughout, which we call the Black Summer bushfires, stretched throughout Queensland, down across New South Wales, across Victoria, over to Tasmania, and through South Australia. The strength, the kind of, not just the intensity, but the breadth of those bushfires would be like fires sweeping kind of from Spain to Russia. It's just almost as big as how Australia is. Lots of people died, enormous amounts of, billions of dollars of damage to property. The plume of smoke could be seen in New Zealand. But what we can't really, and ecosystems of quite a diversity also destroyed. We actually can't count the numbers of animals killed in that, and just kind of hectares of land affected. To give you an example, I live right in the centre of Sydney. For weeks, I actually couldn't leave my home. My children have asthma. You would leave the house and there would just be a kind of a blanket of smoke. When you would walk through the city, sometimes you couldn't even see 2 blocks because of just the intensity of the smoke. And in fact, as many people died of asthma because ambulances couldn't get to them because of the nature of the smoke in cities than actually died of the fires. What happened at that time, of course, is that those fires had been in many ways predicted by Australian climate scientists decades before, that if we didn't reduce emissions, if we didn't act on climate, that if we didn't manage our land appropriately, we would actually have these kinds of fires. And of course, for the climate movement, there was a sense that the fires were the persuadable message, right? That of course people would look at these fires and say, yes, climate change is real, and we need to do something about it. And while it's true that the fires did shift some people from what we would say from concern to alarmed, it was still clear at the time that the climate movement's messaging was not persuading people who were a bit doubtful or perhaps disengaged from the issue of climate. It was just making people who were on their way to being very concerned about climate, it kind of hurried them along a bit. At the time too, we had a really concerted mis- and disinformation campaign through the mainstream media, thanks to Rupert Murdoch and his control of, his kind of, control of some of the media in Australia, as well as online, saying that these fires were not caused and made so intense by climate change, but were caused by other reasons, like, environmentalists stopping people from clearing land, or arsonists, setting fires. And so while the messaging of the climate movement was strong during this campaign, it was undermined by mis- and disinformation at the time, where and we were not equipped either with the tools or really with the personnel to address that. So what you have here is a devastating 2019 loss, a recognition that the climate movement needed to find better ways to communicate with different kinds of audiences, and a really huge and devastating teachable moment that we needed to do something with, but still wasn't necessarily bringing the entirety of the Australian, or, big chunks of the Australian population on to the climate cause. It was at that stage that I was asked by WWF to start to see if we couldn't put the messaging of the kind of Adani campaign behind us to find a more positive, more effective for different kinds of audiences message around the need for Australia to transition as quickly as possible to renewable energy as part of a larger campaign around climate. It was at that stage that I was researching my book on climate change and came across the very, very effective and highly influential Six Americas study coming out of Yale University and George Mason universities. That idea of not just understanding how sentiment around climate played out broadly in terms of percentages, i.e., 80% of Australians care about climate change, but instead focusing on different kinds of audiences characterised by demographics, values, mindset, psychology, and attitudes to climate made a lot of sense to me. The idea that you would have different kinds of audiences that you would need to really deeply understand in order to find a way to communicate them about climate made a lot of sense to me. So I was commissioned, along with a post-election analysis, to do a whole lot of message testing around what would be the most effective way to get people on board with the transition, and particularly audiences that weren't already deep green and weren't already voting on climate. We tested lots and lots of different messages with all of these groups for WWF in the work that they started to do around a larger campaign called Renewable Nation. We tested messages around just transition, around international obligations, around protecting Australia's unique wildlife and biodiversity. Lots of different messages with lots of different different groups, and I was using a kind of a rough framework from the Yale Six Americas study at this stage. And this is the message that really broadcast well across all the groups. You can read it there, but basically saying we're a nation of quiet achievers who invented Wi-Fi. I didn't actually know that was the case. FPOS and the solar cell. So this kind of tapping into this idea that, you know, we're actually pretty smart and pretty good about technology. Australians have a bit of a cultural cringe about this. We don't think that we're very good at much except for kind of swimming and, you know, generating Hemsworths that can go off and be in lots of Hollywood films. We have a little bit of insecurity about those things. So this kind of tapped into that, talked about the fact that we've already got very high rates of solar. In fact, 1 in every 7 households in Australia has solar. And that actually, if we jump on board this important renewable energy revolution, we can become a clean energy powerhouse. So that was the kind of a very positive, very kind of uplifting message, even nationalistic in a way, which is not something that sits very comfortably, I've got to say, with the climate movement, because we tend to be from the kind of left of centre and a bit suspicious of nationalism. But that was the message that worked. In a sense, that work formed the basis of a lot of work that I did after that, and that became a kind of broadcast message, which a lot of the mainstream climate movement kept finding different versions of that message to broadcast between 2019. So just after the fires, we were starting to do this work. Actually, just before the fires, we started to do this work. Leading up to what we knew was going to be an absolutely critical federal election in 2022. It was an enormously effective message. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other work we did. So effective that not only was it language that was used by the climate movement, our now Prime Minister, when he was running for the position, was using these exact words in his speeches. So it was taken up by the political class and also started to, you know, move into the language of the media as well. It is very odd experience to kind of be crafting a narrative, testing it with focus groups, and then being at political events and seeing those words come out of the mouth of the, you know, the future leader. But that's really what happened. And the whole climate movement decided that they needed to get behind a much more positive, what can climate and renewable energy actually do, positively do, rather than a campaign which was about stop a mine. Right. So there was very different tone and I think very different kind of frame that was happening. Of course, if we're going to become a genuine clean energy powerhouse, and if we're going to act on climate, we do have to stop mines, particularly mines that can only be funded with taxpayer money. But it was an important rhetorical shift, one that could actually be quite difficult for the climate movement because, like I said, it kind of leans into that idea of Australia, of that kind of very nationalistic idea about what renewable energy can do for Australia, and a very technocratic one. There's some problems with how far you can take that. That was the kind of first really big piece of foundational narrative and message testing that I did for the climate movement. From that point on, we realised that actually we needed our own version of the Six Americas study, and that's when a foundation called Sunrise decided to launch what we call Climate Compass. So this is both a quantitative and a qualitative study that divides up the Australian population according to particular kinds of audiences. Those audiences are determined largely on their attitudes to climate, but they also, underneath those attitudes, are a particular kind of mindset, not just to the issue of climate, but also values, attitudes to nature in general, attitudes to government. There are key demographic skews in all of these segments. When we launched this, we didn't know how well it would necessarily be used or taken up, but it's been incredibly successful. It was used as the guiding framework for the entire climate movement leading up to the 2022, but also by the finance sector, large institutions like the Australian Museum, local government, at that stage quite a lot of state governments that were either of left-wing governments, Labor governments, or also kind of conservative governments, but conservative governments that were committed to acting on climate. And it was being used quite extensively to to basically orient the climate movement towards really understanding those two middle audiences, the concerned and the cautious. If you look at the compass, you can see that it divides Australians up into 7 segments, but in many ways it divides them up into kind of 3 groupings. The alarmed and the alert, so 30% of the population, these are people who not only say on surveys they care about climate, but vote for progressive climate parties and are doing a lot of actions on climate. Those are the kinds of people who we already have. They're not, I mean, in a sense, we want to make sure that they're activated and they continue to do things and they continue to be articulate in their concerns around climate in their communities and their workplaces, you know, on Twitter and all the rest of it. But really, who we need to shift are those two middle audiences. These are people who think climate change is an issue, want governments to do more, but often don't act on it. They're not necessarily voting on the basis of climate, and really understanding their mindset and communicating to them was seen as absolutely critical to be able to shift the politics and shift the national discussion around climate. These two groups, I spent, you know, every week for 2 years doing focus groups with these groups, putting all different kinds of messages in front of them and kind of understanding how we need to talk to them about climate. These were groups that had not really responded particularly well to the Adani campaign and that kind of what people might say is kind of negative messaging, stop doing this thing, rather than what positive co-benefits can acting on climate mean for Australia right now. So a positive economic message, a very, like I say, locally focused message rather than international message. So we really got a real sense of what those two big audiences needed, because those two audiences are in many ways the audiences that decide elections in Australia. Just as an aside, the electoral politics of Australia is a bit odd. We have compulsory voting in Australia. That, you know, over 90% of all Australians vote, and vote formally, like vote correctly in elections. So you never have to worry about turnout. So Australians turn out. We're actually very, very compliant individuals. We do what the government tells us in many ways. So that means that elections are all about swinging voters, so people who shift their vote in different elections. We don't really, and so we kind of everybody's obsessed with swinging voters in marginal seats. And so really understand, so that's where the swinging voters were in those two groups. They're the people who don't, and whereas the people on this side, on the alarmed and alert, tend to vote Green, tend to vote Conservative. People on the other groups tend to be more conservative. Sorry, the alarmed and the alert tend to vote Green, Labor, and the people on this other side, on the right-wing side, tend to vote for Conservative parties. Important to note too that only about 9% of the community are people we would describe as dismissive, and even within that, there's only about 3% of people who are deniers, like hardcore deniers. So that was the kind of audience map, and that really oriented the climate movement to work out, okay, who do we really need to talk to, and does the kind of language that we've used in previous campaigns engage this group, or does it actually alienate them? And so this was really, if we thought about the Australian community in terms of these audiences, this was very clearly the challenge that we had in a very short period of time to, like I said, shift the politics and really kind of create a situation where we could actually not be the laggard on climate that Australia has been for some time. And a big part of it was trying to, in that mission, to reassure and persuade people who are concerned, alert and cautious that acting on climate could be in their interest and in the national interest. And what was the kind of language, what was the kind of, who were the messengers that they were really going to listen to? And that was the kind of mission on a page. My role was really spending an enormous amount of time for a lot of the climate movement and a lot of big climate orgs of all kinds to do lots of message and narrative testing. And I'm just going to share a couple of little projects that I did at that time. This and the Climate Compass oriented all of that. People were starting to come to me and say, right, well, how do we encourage this particular audience? How do we encourage the concerned to be more supportive about renewable energy in their homes? And how do we talk to the cautious about the jobs that can be generated through a transition to renewable energy? So one of the so many projects, I was hard to really choose which one I wanted to talk to you about. But one of the really interesting ones I did was for a joint project for WWF, again, and the Australian Conservation Foundation, also funded by Sunrise. We wanted to understand, how do we talk to people who live in fossil fuel dominated industries and areas of Australia? So there's an area not very far from Sydney called the Hunter Valley. It's been a coal mining area and actually a wine making area as well, interestingly, for a very, very long time, for nearly 100 years. And also, again, up in northern Queensland in a place called Gladstone, where there is an enormous amount of coal as well coming in and out of Gladstone. How do we talk to people in those areas about the transition? Because for them, not only are jobs tied up in coal there, identity is tied up there. They sometimes wonder, those regions have been built off the back of coal, and in many ways the idea that that would be taken away without it being replaced by something, the jobs or you know, the industry and the future, makes people very anxious. So one of the things we toyed with, one of the things that ended up being, and this is a hard sell, I have to tell you, how do you sell the end of coal in places that are so focused on coal, particularly when at that stage we didn't have a government that was going to kind of come in and really shepherd that transition with a great amount of support for those workers. So we really were working with a government that was antagonistic to any of this. This was a message that really worked the best, and this is kind of idea that in order we have to change to say the same. We started to think about those areas and talk about those areas as areas that have been critically important to Australia's economy because they've generated energy, right? So not so much talking about coal, but energy. And so we really wanted to lean into the incredible contribution these areas have made to Australian prosperity and really honour that, rather than saying it's something to be ashamed of. And so here's this story that that resonated best in those areas, which, like I said, was the hard sell. Exporting energy in the form of coal and gas has long been one of Australia's major exports. It's helped us prosper. It's employed many Australians over the years. But the world's energy needs are changing. And in fact, even in those areas, even though those areas are so tied up with coal, they know that coal isn't going to be there in 50 or 100 years. They know that renewable energy is the energy of the future. They just know that they've also got to put food on the table. They also know they have to pay their bills. So transition or transformation is terrifying for people in those areas that are so exposed to, economically exposed, when we talk about transition. Anyway, but if we want to keep exporting energy to the world, we will need to make the switch away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. We need to set ourselves up to generate secure jobs now and into the future and look after the planet. The other thing that is constantly, you know, is I think a misnomer and a sign of disrespect for the communities that live in these areas built by coal and gas as well, which is a big fossil fuel export and in WA, is there's a kind of assumption that people who live in these areas don't care about the environment, don't care about climate, don't care about these issues. They do, but they also have far more pressing, what they would say, material concerns. And certainly they want to believe in the idea that Australia can transition to renewable energy and act on climate and protect nature in a way where they feel that their livelihood, their children will be in some ways protected by that. There's a very difficult message to sell, particularly because they knew that the government weren't necessarily going to come in, set up a transition authority, help them move from one, help that industry transition. Very different now. That's certainly a big part of government policy. But that message really, really resonated in those areas. And then sorry, I don't know what's happening. And I suppose the other interesting thing, and this shows why a focus on audience and place is so critical when you're talking about climate, is we did another project, again funded by Australian Conservation Foundation, WWF, trying to speak to inner and outer metro, so inner metropolitan, outer metropolitan audiences, in what we would say people who are concerned about climate. So they're not alarmed, they're not climate isn't their number one issue, they're not voting on climate. Climate is their maybe third, fourth, fifth issue, but they very much push it out as a kind of future issue. Like it's a worry, but it's not the most pressing worry for me today. Interestingly, and this shows how different when you start thinking about audiences and you're thinking about that combination of audience and place, this was the message that worked best with those audiences. And this was around this idea that we just have to choose. We have to pick a winner. Again, what's the thing that what's the belief that these audiences in these places and the other audiences I was talking about in coal regions, what's one of the beliefs that they both share? They both know that coal, oil and gas are energy, aren't the future of the energy needs of either Australia or the world. It's a question of how quickly we can go and what impact it's going to have on me. That just tends to be the live issue. And so here the message that worked really well with them was one around this idea about we've got to be strategic. We've got to choose where we direct our people, skills and resources when it comes to energy. We want to embrace this clean energy future that will future-proof the economy. So again, you can see that that's a message that works well with people who aren't necessarily directly employed in fossil fuel industry. So perhaps it's a bit easier for them to say, let's go down this direction rather than the other. They probably need less assurance. They probably and they probably feel that they're a little bit more likely to think about the impact that this has on the nation rather than necessarily on their region as well. But that idea of choice, of positive choice, let's choose this direction rather than the other, worked extremely well for them as well. So, I don't want to give away the punchline here. So the climate movement did an enormous amount of work oriented by the Climate Compass, focusing on concerned and cautious audiences and thinking about how do we talk to them in ways that really connect with their values, with their mindset, with their hopes for the economy of Australia, the well-being of their region, of their homes, and it was very positive. It was positive, like I said, in some ways even a bit nationalistic, very locally focused as well, very much about Australia rather than necessarily Australia's obligations globally. That was all tactical, really trying to get that group to vote for climate, and also to have a more effective campaign that would see a change of government. There was no doubt that the government at the time, led by then Prime Minister Morrison, who was holding the coal lump, was not a very popular man. He didn't behave very well during the fires. He went on holidays in Hawaii. He was made many mistakes during the COVID, the pandemic. And interestingly, public concerns around climate stayed pretty steady and strong during the COVID pandemic. So very much not a popular leader, but we were also finding that concerns around climate driven by the fires and also driven by this kind of idea that we might be left behind in a global transition towards renewable energy were really showing that that climate messaging was gaining traction at that time. And so, of course, we're all working very a lot in the lead up to the 2022 election because there was a lot at stake. And on the night of the election, I was in a room full of the climate movement. We were on the phones working the media, and it was clear very early on that this was the climate election that we were supposed to have in 2019 had actually arrived in 2020. Not only did it see the election of a Labor government with a much stronger and position on climate, and also much stronger rhetoric on climate as well. We saw the election of an unprecedented number of independent members of parliament in the lower house, whose number one policy was around climate. So they were called climate or teal independents. Teal is a colour which is a mixture of blue and green. So they were in Conservative seats, winning those seats as independents, basically on the back of a huge wave of concern around climate. We also saw some of those climate independents elected to the Senate. We also saw some Greens elected to the lower house, which is really quite extraordinary. So just Greens members elected to the lower house in Queensland, of all places. But what was even more important and did not happen in 2019 is that in contests between the Labor Party and the Conservatives, so where there weren't climate-based independents and there weren't Greens necessarily in the contest, it was climate as a concern that was driving that Labor vote, right? And of course, in our parliamentary system, you form government by how many seats you have in the lower house. So this national concern around climate actually drove an election which has really driven the Conservatives, who still remain woefully, teetering on the edge of denial still. It's basically pushed them out of not only federal government, at least for 2 terms, but in every state and territory except bar one in Australia. And now there is a really, really strong, political move around acting around climate. Is it perfect? No, but we're actually starting to see Australia do a whole range of things that it hasn't done for a very long time on climate, and that's been the outcome. But the political outcome was huge. It was extraordinary. And, we were doing news programs around the world that night on BBC and everywhere talking about the role that climate played. Then we decided to redo the compass to see, well, what had actually shifted over that time and, to get this incredible result. And here's what we got. This is fascinating. So what we actually had was not massive segment change, which is not what you expect because these segments are so big and they're kind of so entrenched. But what we actually saw is a move of people who were cautious and concerned kind of over to the alarmed, right? So almost you kind of say a 2% increase of the alarmed, largely at the expense of the cautious and concerned. Some of this is just about above the margin of error, but I think that's what we've been seeing in compasses that have been done like this around the world, is that over time you start to see the people who are really, really focused on climate, particularly in their voting patterns, increase. And when you just get that small increase, so all you really need is 2% of the population suddenly go, climate is a big thing, you actually start to see, a much bigger impact that has in electoral contests, because in an election like ours, where everybody turns out and votes, sometimes the difference between a seat being Conservative or Labor or Green or Conservative or climate-driven independent is only 200, 300, 500 votes. So you actually can switch a seat and switch a government by just switching a small group of people. And if climate is one of the things they're really responding to, you have a Conservative government that is really Neanderthals when it comes on climate, all you're starting to do is like shifting that slowly, and huge impact, because then you start to be able to do the kinds of things that previously you'd only hoped to be able to do. And we've seen quite a lot happening in Australia around climate policy as well. Not perfect, but still we're really playing an enormous amount of catch up at the moment. So, and And so it really was in the last election, those who swung independent skewed towards those who were in that alarmed group, because that's the other thing we did quite a bit of. Not only were we targeting and really trying to understand those concerned and cautious, we were trying to get people in that alarmed group who previously would have voted Conservative to actually say, now it's really time, think about how you can vote on climate as well. So I think, I've got a little bit of time for questions and I'll stop sharing. That's a lot of information. If you've got any interest in reading anything more about the compass, we have a website with all the information. If you want any recommendations of articles to read about the 2022 election, that it was the climate election, I'm happy to send that to you, and happy to send any resources that you'd be interested in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca. It was powerful and very, very interesting for us and also for the audience, because I'm receiving many questions for you. So I would start from Carla's question, which is about if there is also a research on what the same people who are concerned about the climate are already doing to change their own lives, and what communication would be useful in this regard?
That's a great question. And Carla, I can, if you go onto the Climate Compass website, I can send it to Alessandra and she can share it with people. The Climate Compass study also asks people what they're doing. It gives them a list of 36 actions that they could be doing for the climate, everything from putting solar panels to voting on climate to writing a petition to, you know, eating less meat, a whole range of activities. We ask them what they are doing and what they're open to doing. And we have embedded in that research a behaviour change model called the COMB model, where we really understand what are the barriers to action. So we really set the Climate Compass up not just as a sentiment tracker, but also as a tool for people who are looking to shift behaviour. Not surprisingly, the alarmed are the people that are doing the most actions most often and most complex actions. So everything from what they're doing in their own home to how they're managing their money to how they're what they're researching to the personal private advocacy they're doing. And we understand what some of the barriers are to further action. Some of the most common actions that Australians are open to doing around climate at the moment are replacing gas appliances, so the electrification agenda, so getting rid of gas appliances. Natural gas is still something that's used quite a lot on the Australian mainland. We export an enormous amount of gas. Reducing energy use, so energy efficiency agenda is particularly important, investment in renewable energy. But the other thing that's becoming quite common that people are more and more interested in is we have a kind of something called superannuation, which is like a obligatory pension fund that we all have to pay our employer pays a certain amount of percentage of our work into. So we all have a super fund that we're supposed to access when we turn 65 to fund our retirement, and a lot of interest in divesting our personal super away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. So using financial products as a way to express our concern around climate.
Thank you, Rebecca. I have an interesting question by Jin Feng Go, who asks, maybe the most important question is how to get people out to vote like the Australians do.
All right. Well, do you know, it is incredible, isn't it? So it is quite amazing. Like I mean, there's lots of, as you would know, there's a lot of political systems that have compulsory voting. In Australia, if you don't vote, you get fined about $220. I mean, for some people, that's a lot. Most people just vote. Most people just turn up and they vote. But I think and that's a good thing, but I think that the thing that is more concerning is even though they vote formally, so they don't kind of, you know, you're not forced to vote, but you're forced to kind of turn up and put the ballot in the box. is I'm not sure that Australians think about it deeply. I think there's a real problem with engagement. There's a real problem with accessing information that people trust. And there's a real problem with trust in politics. So I think there's high action, low engagement, and that's our challenge. So we don't have a problem with turning people out. I don't think, because Australians, like I said, we kind of do what we're told to all the time. And that's what happened in COVID. We were all told to stay home and wear a mask and get vaccinated. And that's pretty much what we did. So we're quite compliant. We're quite compliant in many ways. We just are. And there's good things about that. So people vote. My focus now is making sure that people really think about their vote and engage it and believe that it can actually make a difference, because it can.
Since our audience is spread through the world, someone is asking if there are similar research on how different messages work for different groups in Europe, like yours worked for Australia. And another question about the methodology of 6 Americas that you are using. If you see significant difference or similarities of the Australian case with other countries around the world.
Yeah, so look, I'd encourage everybody to go on the 6 Americas website. They have done their version. They've done that kind of, they've employed that framework in many countries, India, and they actually have a Europe-wide framework as well. And so they've done in studies throughout South America, throughout Asia, Indonesia as well. So the methodology, just for quantity people, is basically a regression analysis. You just have a survey where you're actually kind of working out how different groups pull out according to certain kinds of questions, and it tends to kind of boil down to some key questions that determine whether people go into the segmentation. There are different ways to do segmentation for people who are experts at quant, which I'm not. I'm a qualitative researcher. And there are incredible similarities between the United States and Australia. In fact, the segments are almost the same in terms of the quantum, and the trends over time are almost the same, in that the alarms are getting bigger at the expense of people who are already concerned around climate. So it is actually really quite similar. We've got some similar structural problems with the importance of coal, oil and gas, the power of the lobby, the power of the Murdoch press, and a whole range of other things between the two countries as well. Anyway, they've got a wealth of resources in their work, and like I said, I can share those resources. I can share that those links, as well as the work that we've done as well.
Yeah, that would be great. A lot of people is asking me about the resources, the links and things. I will take care of sending them to all the participants after the webinar, when Rebecca will send me the resources. Okay. Yeah. There is Pietro Altermat thanking you for talking about this great success and asking if you could please tell us more about what happened in the background, in the actual design of the climate messages.
Yeah, so I think there was one of the things that the Climate Compass did was encourage, well, there had been enormous collaboration in the Adani campaign. You know, basically the whole climate movement got behind this campaign. So it's not that the climate movement in its various forms can't collaborate. What I think that there was a recognition was that they needed to, if we were going to have a more positive campaign where there wasn't just one message, but different organisations were talking about to different audiences about the importance of climate. They also wanted to make sure that if, let's say, WWF were talking to this group, the messages that they were sending weren't annoying other groups, and there wasn't this kind of collateral damage in a sense. So a lot of my projects were, all right, we want to sell the benefits of, let's say, renewable energy exports to the economy, right? Australia, as if anybody's ever come, has an enormous amount of sun and wind. We have the capacity to produce 200, 300, 400, that 100% renewable energy, like excess energy that we can actually export. So there was a lot of questions about, well, how do we talk about that as a benefit to the alarmed versus to the concerned and the cautious? So often I was testing the same message with different audiences and working out whether we could actually create a unicorn message, or if we talked about it this way to one group, we'd have to adjust it. So I did quite a lot of that, just like endless focus groups, focus group after focus group, sharing, and also sharing those insights with other people as well. So that's kind of how that happened. It was such a blessing to be able to kind of, it was so invigorating to be able to do that work and see it employed and see it work well.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm receiving so many questions. I have to select some of them. Sandra Fritsch is asking, how do you deal with people who are very pessimistic? For example, people with a cynical attitude who say that it is already too late and that climate protection is useless.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, because where we differ from the Yale Six Americas, we have a special seventh segment called the Alert, which are kind of we argue is a new emerging group. It's not very big. It's a group that tend to skew to younger and to male, not exclusively obviously, but that tends to be a skew in that group. And they believe climate change is a huge issue. They believe the science, they believe it's a threat. But 50% of that group, so half of that group, if you say to them it's not too late to do something about it, disagree. So they're not doomers, but they kind of feel like we've lost our opportunity to really act effectively on climate change. So there's a cynicism and pessimism in that group. The moment I'm working with a lot of small organisations based around things like football, surfing, a lot of sport. Is one way to the heart of an Australian male is through sport, to say that it actually isn't too late. So a big part of it is how we address practical action, particularly practical action that can generate jobs. So that's some of the work that we're doing in messaging. It is still really difficult. A big part of how we address cynicism is also pointing to what are the tangible, immediate co-benefits of acting on climate. So one of them is around, well, you might not think that emissions cause the climate to change, understandable. But if we actually had less pollution in the air, then people would be healthier, there'd be less asthma. So a part of that is around trying to articulate the other benefits of acting on climate with that group, because they're like, oh, well, I'll do it. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe it's got nothing to do with climate. Maybe it's not going to be effective, but that might be a good thing. So travel, getting into more active transport is a good example. Putting on solar panels because it just happens to can cut your energy prices in half, and given energy prices are pretty high at the moment. So things like that, but it's difficult. That pessimism, and let's face it, I understand the pessimism. All that you have to do is read the science, and it can be a bit confronting. Not a bit confronting, really confronting.
Mauro Bonocore of CMCC says, I understand that people in the right side of the graph are the more disinformed or vulnerable to disinformation. So how
Absolutely.
do you plan to deal with disinformation?
It's a really good point. And we're still struggling with that, I've got to say. So after the bushfires, there was so much dis and misinformation around the causes of the bushfires, that we set up through the Sunrise Project, with the collaboration of the climate movement, a misinformation dashboard. And so what it essentially is it's like a media monitoring device, where we're trying to actually look at all the internet and media traffic around climate events and see what narratives are starting to develop. So So we're tracking mis and disinformation. There's some really good work being done around trying to, how do you embed in messages that you send out around climate, are kind of already trying to address what might be the disinformation about that, but it is really difficult. And in fact, in the work I'm doing with the federal government, I ask, ministers and their staff and bureaucrats all the time, what are you doing about mis and disinformation? And they say, we're really worried about it and we don't know what to do. So if anybody's come across any really fantastic tools or devices or anything around that you could share, it'd be really useful. But it's a huge problem. I mean, not only do you need to have the technology to monitor it, you need to have the teams to address it. And I think this is, probably one of the most pressing problems within the whole climate communication sphere, is how do we get on top of this?
Great, Rebecca. I have many other questions, but time is running out. Yeah. I will share the questions with Rebecca, so
Please
that
do. Yeah.
if you want to give feedback to some of them, you can, and you have the possibility. We are anyway preparing some material. We are publishing an article on climateforesight.eu about the contents Rebecca showed today. So you will find there some information, resources, the links she will send us, and so on. And I thank you all. Yes, I forgot to tell you that we're talking about Anthony Leserowitz of the Six Americas. We are also publishing an interview to him very soon on Climate Foresight. So the topic is going to be analyzed in depth there, and also on the forthcoming Foresight Dialogues that I invite you to follow. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Your presentation was great and very, very interesting for us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
And thank you to all participants.